The sun hung low and merciless over the empty platform, casting long shadows across the weathered boards. Margaret Thorne stood alone, her Boston-made traveling dress already coated with a fine layer of desert dust. The last train had departed 20 minutes ago, its whistle still echoing in her memory like a mocking farewell. She clutched her carpetbag with trembling hands, watching the iron tracks stretch endlessly into the horizon where they disappeared into heat mirages. At 58, Margaret had never felt so thoroughly abandoned. The station master's shack stood locked and empty, a handwritten sign declaring he'd return tomorrow, Lord willing. Tomorrow, in this desolate place, tomorrow might as well have been a lifetime away. She had left everything behind in Boston, the suffocating propriety, the whispered judgments, the house that still smelled of her late husband William's pipe tobacco, all for her brother Samuel Cooper, the only family she had left in this world. His last letter, dated 6 months ago, had spoken of opportunities in a place called Redemption Gulch. Now she stood stranded between worlds, neither here nor there, with the desert wind beginning to pick up as evening approached. Margaret tried to swallow, but her throat was parched. The water in her flask had run low hours ago. She looked around desperately for any sign of civilization, but saw only sagebrush, red rocks, and endless sky. The platform offered no shelter, just 2 wooden benches and a broken lamppost. Fear crept up her spine like cold fingers despite the lingering heat. Then she saw him. He emerged from the desert itself, materializing from behind a cluster of sandstone boulders as if he'd been part of the landscape moments before. An Apache man, tall and lean, with silver threading through his long black hair. His clothes were a mixture of traditional and modern leather leggings, a cotton shirt, a wide-brimmed hat shadowing eyes that seemed to hold the wisdom of the ancient rocks themselves. Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs. Every terrible story she'd heard back east flooded her mind. She stood frozen, her hand instinctively moving to the small derringer in her bag, a gift from William years ago. "Just in case." The man stopped 20 feet away, studying her with an expression she couldn't read. When he spoke, his voice was deep and measured, each word deliberate as stones dropped into still water. "God said you belong here. Be my bride." The words hung in the air between them, incomprehensible. Margaret's mind reeled. Was this some kind of threat? A cultural misunderstanding had the heat finally driven her to hallucinations. I beg your pardon," she managed, her proper Boston accent sounding absurd in this wild place. The man, he appeared to be near her own age, remained motionless. "You are lost," he said simply. It wasn't a question. "The train, I missed." Margaret's voice cracked. She cleared her throat and tried again. "My brother lives in Redemption Gulch, Samuel Cooper. Perhaps you know him." Something shifted in the man's dark eyes, a flicker of recognition followed by something else, sorrow. Perhaps. He nodded slowly. "Come. Night brings death in the desert." Margaret looked back at the empty platform, then at the stranger. Every instinct screamed at her to refuse, to wait for help that might never come. But the sun was sinking fast, painting the sky in shades of blood and amber. Already the temperature was dropping, and she'd heard stories of how cold the desert became after dark. Snakes, coyotes, worse things hunted in the darkness. "I'm waiting for someone," she lied, though her voice betrayed her uncertainty. "No one comes until tomorrow's train." He turned and began walking back toward the rocks. "Come, or stay and meet the spirits. Your choice." Margaret watched him go, her mind racing. She thought of Samuel, of the journey that had brought her this far. She thought of her life in Boston, safe, predictable, slowly suffocating her. She had already taken the greatest risk by leaving. What was one more? "Wait!" She picked up her carpetbag and hurried after him, her boots slipping on the loose stones. "I'm coming." The man he hadn't offered his name led her along a path she never would have found alone. They walked in silence as the stars began to emerge, brilliant and countless in the clear air. Margaret had never seen stars like this in Boston's sooty skies. Despite her fear, she found herself mesmerized by their beauty. After what felt like hours, but was probably less than one, lights appeared ahead. Redemption Gulch materialized from the darkness like something from a fever dream. Oil lamps glowed in windows of rough-hewn buildings. The sound of a piano drifted from somewhere, mixed with laughter and the occasional shout. The smell of horses, leather, and cooking fires filled the air. The man led her down the main street, past a saloon where men spilled onto the wooden sidewalk, past a general store with bars on its windows, past a small church with a crooked cross. He stopped at a 2-story building with a sign reading Gonzalez Boarding House Clean Beds, Hot Meals. "Here," he said, gesturing to the door. "Rosa will care for you." Before Margaret could thank him or even ask his name, he turned to go. "Wait," she called. "Why did you say what you said about God and—" She couldn't bring herself to repeat the word bride. He looked back at her, his face unreadable in the lamplight. "Sometimes God speaks. Sometimes we must wait to understand his words." Then he walked away, disappearing into the shadows between buildings as completely as he'd appeared in the desert. Margaret stood there, shaking now from more than cold. She knocked on the boarding house door with a trembling hand. It opened to reveal a sturdy Mexican woman in her 50s. Her gray-streaked hair pulled back severely, but her brown eyes kind. "You look like death walking," the woman said in accented English. Come in. I am Rosa Gonzalez. That one brought you." She nodded in the direction the man had gone. "Yes, I missed the train. I'm looking for my brother, Samuel Cooper." Rosa's face changed, the kindness replaced by something careful and sad. She ushered Margaret inside, into a small parlor that smelled of chili and wood smoke. "Sit. I bring you water, food, then we talk about Samuel." The way she said his name made Margaret's stomach drop. She sank into a worn armchair, suddenly exhausted beyond measure. Rosa returned with a glass of cool water and a plate of beans and cornbread. Margaret drank greedily, then forced herself to eat though her appetite had fled. "My brother," she said when she could speak again. "Where is Samuel?" Rosa sat across from her, her weathered hands folded in her lap. "I am sorry, Señora, your brother, Samuel died 6 months ago. The sickness took him. We buried him in the cemetery on the hill." The words hit Margaret like physical blows. 6 months, while she'd been planning her escape, gathering courage, selling her belongings. Samuel had already been gone. She'd left everything for a ghost. "No," she whispered. "His letter. He wrote about opportunities, about starting fresh." "See, he had plans, always talking, your brother, about bringing you here, about the mine claims, about making things right." Rosa reached over and patted Margaret's hand. "He spoke of you often, said you were imprisoned in a fine house, needed to breathe free air." The tears came then, great gasping sobs that shook Margaret's entire body. She cried for Samuel, for herself, for the wasted years and missed chances. Rosa held her, murmuring comfort in Spanish, until the storm passed. Later, Rosa showed her to a small, clean room on the 2nd floor. "This was Samuel's room. His things are in the trunk there. Tomorrow, you decide what to do. Tonight, you rest." Margaret sat on the narrow bed, looking around at the sparse furnishings. A trunk, a washstand, a single chair. On the wall hung a small mirror and a calendar still showing January 1896 months old. This was where Samuel had lived his last days, far from everything familiar, chasing dreams in this hard place. She opened the trunk with shaking hands. Inside were his few possessions, work clothes, a Bible, some mining tools, and papers. So many papers. Maps, deeds, letters. One letter, unfinished, caught her eye. Her name was at the top. "My dear Margaret." It began. By the time you receive this, I hope to have proof of what I've discovered. The land here holds secrets, and blood, and lies that go back 40 years. There is a man here, Blackwood, who... The letter ended mid-sentence. Margaret read it again, then looked through the other papers. References to land disputes, to something that happened to the Apache people, to names she didn't recognize. Whatever Samuel had been investigating, he'd taken the knowledge to his grave. She lay back on the hard mattress, still in her traveling dress, too exhausted to undress. Outside, redemption. Gulch continued its nocturnal life shouts, music, the occasional gunshot. But in this small room that had been her brother's last home, Margaret felt the crushing weight of solitude. She thought of the Apache man's strange words. God said you belong here. What could that mean? Why had he helped her? And why did she feel, despite everything, that her journey was just beginning rather than ending? As sleep finally claimed her, Margaret's last coherent thought was that she had nowhere to go back to. Boston was closed to her now, as surely as if it had never existed. She was here in Redemption Gulch, alone, with only questions and a dead man's mysteries for company. The desert wind rattled the windows, and somewhere in the darkness, a coyote howled at the stars. Morning light filtered through the thin curtains, revealing dust motes dancing in the air like tiny spirits. Margaret woke with a start, momentarily confused by the unfamiliar surroundings before the crushing memory of yesterday returned. Samuel was dead. She was alone in Redemption Gulch with nothing but questions and a trunk full of mysteries. She rose stiffly, her body protesting after sleeping in her traveling clothes. The pitcher on the washstand held fresh water. Rosa must have filled it while she slept. Margaret cleaned herself as best she could, then changed into her simplest dress, a gray wool more suitable for this rough place than her Boston finery. The trunk drew her like a magnet. In the clear morning light, she examined Samuel's papers more carefully. There were mining claims, certainly, but also newspaper clippings about land disputes, sketches of boundary markers, and several references to something called Eagle Rock. One document, water-stained and barely legible, appeared to be a witness statement signed by someone named Joseph Clearwater. At the very bottom of the trunk, wrapped in oilcloth, she found something that made her breath catch a piece of carved stone about the size of her palm. The carving depicted an eagle in flight, its wings spread wide, executed with remarkable skill. The stone seemed to pulse with meaning, though Margaret couldn't say why. A knock interrupted her thoughts. Rosa entered with a tray of coffee and fresh bread. "You found it," she said, nodding at the stone in Margaret's hands. "Samuel, he was very careful with that, said it was important." "What is it?" Rosa set down the tray and closed the door. "Sacred stone, Apache. Your brother, he met with the one who brought you here, many times, secret meetings." She lowered her voice. "Dangerous talk about old crimes. The man last night, who is he? They call him Eli Crowwalker. He walks between worlds, Apache and white. Lost his family long ago." Rosa's face darkened. "Mr. Blackwood doesn't like him coming to town." Blackwood, the name from Samuel's unfinished letter. Who is this Blackwood? Josiah Blackwood owns the largest ranch, the bank, the mining company. He owns Redemption Gulch. Some say, even the sheriff tips his hat to Mr. Blackwood. Rosa moved to the window, peering out as if merely speaking the name might summon him. "Your brother asked too many questions about Mr. Blackwood. Now your brother is dead." A chill ran down Margaret's spine. "Are you suggesting—" "I suggest nothing. The doctor said fever took Samuel, but fever comes in many forms." "Yes." Rosa turned back to her. "You should take the next train east. Senora, nothing here but sorrow." Margaret looked at the carved stone in her hands, at the papers spread across the bed. Samuel had died pursuing something he believed important enough to risk everything. Could she do less? "I need to understand what my brother was investigating." she said quietly. This stone, these papers, they meant something to him. Rosa sighed deeply. Then you are as stubborn as he was. Very well, but be careful. The desert has many ways to kill, and not all of them are natural. After Rosa left, Margaret organized Samuel's papers methodically, a skill learned from years of managing household accounts. A pattern emerged. 40 years ago, there had been a massacre at a place called Eagle Rock. Apache families, including women and children, had been killed. The official story blamed renegade soldiers, but Samuel's notes suggested something different, that local ranchers, led by a young Josiah Blackwood, had orchestrated the attack to seize sacred Apache lands. Among the victims, according to a faded military report, was a woman named Mary Crow Walker Eli's sister. If Margaret understood the connection correctly, there was mention of a missing child, never found. As she read, Margaret felt a strange sensation, as if she were being pulled into a story larger than herself. She touched the carved eagle stone and seemed to feel an echo of old grief, old rage, old injustice demanding to be heard. A commotion in the street below drew her to the window. An elegant carriage had stopped outside the boarding house, black lacquered wood with brass fittings that gleamed in the morning sun. The door opened and a man emerged, tall, silver-haired, wearing a black suit that probably cost more than most folks in Redemption Gulch saw in a year. Even from the second floor, Margaret could feel the power radiating from him. This had to be Josiah Blackwood. He looked up, as if sensing her gaze, and their eyes met. His were the palest blue she'd ever seen, like winter ice. He touched the brim of his hat in a mockery of courtesy, then entered the boarding house. Margaret's heart pounded. She quickly gathered Samuel's papers, shoving them back in the trunk. The carved stone she slipped into her pocket, its weight oddly comforting. Heavy footsteps climbed the stairs, accompanied by Rosa's protesting voice. The knock, when it came, was perfunctory. Blackwood entered without waiting for permission, filling the small room with his presence. Up close, she could see he was perhaps 70, his face carved by years of sun and wind into something hard as granite. Mrs. Thorne, he said, his voice cultured but with an underlying roughness. My condolences on your loss. Samuel was a persistent man. Thank you, Margaret managed, her chin raised despite her fear. I understand you're newly arrived and in unfortunate circumstances. As a leader of this community, I feel obligated to offer assistance. He reached into his coat and produced a leather wallet. The eastbound train passes through tomorrow. I would be happy to purchase your ticket and provide traveling funds. Boston is far, and a widow should be among her own people. The offer was generous, too generous. Margaret understood she was being bought off, run out of town before she could cause whatever trouble Samuel had been brewing. Part of her, the part shaped by years of Boston propriety, wanted to accept, to flee this hard place and its dangerous secrets. But she felt the weight of the carved stone in her pocket and heard Samuel's voice in her memory, talking about prisons made of propriety and the need to breathe free. That's very kind, Mr. Blackwood, she said carefully. But I haven't yet decided my plans. There are my brother's affairs to settle. His pale eyes narrowed slightly. Samuel left little of value. I'm afraid some worthless mining claims, debts at the general store. I'd be willing to purchase his claims for enough to clear his obligations. Call it charity. I need time to go through his papers, understand his business. His business, Blackwood interrupted, his voice hardening, was stirring up old grievances better left buried. The frontier was a violent place 40 years ago. Mrs. Thorne. Terrible things happened on all sides, but we've built civilization here. Order. Progress. Your brother seemed determined to drag up ancient history that serves no one. Perhaps some history needs dragging up, Margaret said before she could stop herself. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Blackwood stepped closer, and Margaret caught a scent of expensive tobacco and something else, something that reminded her of predators. "You're grieving," he said softly. "I'll forgive that impertinence. But let me be clear. Mrs. Thorne, this is not Boston. This is my town. The Apache are contained on their reservation where they belong. The past is dead and buried at Eagle Rock, and anyone who tries to resurrect it will find themselves keeping it company. Do I make myself understood?" Margaret's hands trembled, but she kept her voice steady. "Perfectly, Mr. Blackwood." He studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "The offer of a ticket east remains open, for now." He turned to leave, then paused at the door. "Oh, and that savage who brought you here last night, Eli Crow Walker, is not welcome in town. Any decent woman would know better than to associate with his kind. Good day, Mrs. Thorne." After his footsteps faded, Margaret sank onto the bed. Shaking, Rosa appeared in the doorway, her face grave. "Now you see," the older woman said. "Now you understand why your brother is dead." Margaret touched the carved stone through the fabric of her pocket. Blackwood had just threatened her. Certainly, but he'd also revealed something crucial. Whatever happened at Eagle Rock was important enough to kill for, even 40 years later. And Eli Crow Walker was at the center of it. "Rosa," she said, surprising herself with a firmness in her voice. "How do I find Eli Crow Walker?" Rosa crossed herself. "Senora, did you not hear what Mr. Blackwood said?" "I heard him perfectly. That's why I need to find Eli." Rosa studied her for a long moment, then sighed. "Follow the creek upstream, past the old mine, where the water splits around a great stone. Look for the eagle carved in rock. Wait there. If he wishes to be found, he will come." Margaret stood, smoothing her skirts. She had a choice to make. She could take Blackwood's money and run, return to the safety of her prison-like life in Boston, or she could follow the path Samuel had started, seeking truth in this hard land. She thought of the Apache man's strange words. "God said you belong here." Maybe God, or fate, or simply the stubborn streak that ran in the Cooper family blood, had brought her here for a reason. "Thank you, Rosa," she said, moving toward the door. "Wait," Rosa called. She went to a drawer and pulled out something wrapped in cloth. "Samuel left this for you. He said if you ever came west, you would need it." Margaret unwrapped the cloth to reveal a small revolver, well-maintained and loaded. Samuel had known, somehow. He'd known she would come, and he'd known she would need protection. She slipped the gun into her pocket opposite the carved stone, one for death, one for truth. Then she walked out into the harsh light of Redemption Gulch, ready to follow her brother's ghost into whatever darkness awaited. The invitation arrived 3 days later, delivered by a Mexican boy who refused to meet Margaret's eyes. Thick cream paper, Blackwood seal in black wax, the handwriting elegant as any Boston correspondence. "Mrs. Thorne, your presence is requested for dinner at the Blackwood estate this evening. A carriage will call at 7. J.B." Margaret read it twice, her stomach nodding. Since her meeting with Eli at Eagle Rock, she'd spent her days going through Samuel's papers, piecing together the tragedy of 40 years past. Now Blackwood was making his move, and she couldn't refuse without arousing more suspicion. "You must go," Rosa said when Margaret showed her the invitation. "To refuse is to declare war, but Senora, be careful. No woman goes to that house alone and comes back unchanged." At 7 precisely, the black carriage appeared. The driver, a thin man with dead eyes, helped her inside without speaking. They rode out of town, past the last shabby buildings, into countryside dominated by Blackwood's vast holdings. The sun was setting, painting the desert in shades of blood. The Blackwood estate rose from the landscape like a monument to conquest. 3 stories of imported stone and timber, with carved pillars and leaded glass windows that caught the dying light. Gardens struggled against the desert, maintained by an army of Mexican workers who kept their heads down as the carriage passed. Blackwood met her at the door himself, dressed in evening wear that wouldn't have been out of place in New York. "Mrs. Thorne, how lovely you look. Please, come in." The interior was overwhelming crystal chandeliers, Persian rugs, oil paintings of European landscapes, a fortune spent to deny the desert outside. Margaret felt like she was suffocating in artificial grandeur. "Sherry," Blackwood offered, leading her to a parlor dominated by a massive fireplace. Above the mantel hung a painting of a younger Blackwood standing over a dead grizzly bear, rifle in hand, foot on the beast's head. "Thank you." Margaret accepted the crystal glass, needing something to do with her hands. "I must apologize for our rough introduction the other day," Blackwood said, settling into a leather chair that throne-like in its proportions. "Grief makes us all say things we don't mean." Margaret sipped her sherry, saying nothing. Let him reveal his purpose. "I've been thinking about your situation," he continued. "A woman alone, no resources, no connections here. It troubles me. What if I were to offer you employment?" "Employment? I need someone to manage my household accounts. My late wife used to handle such things, but since her passing..." He gestured vaguely. "Your brother mentioned you had experience managing a household in Boston." So he'd researched her. Margaret wasn't surprised. "That's a generous offer, Mr. Blackwood." "I'm a generous man, to those who deserve it." His pale eyes studied her over his glass. "Of course, such a position would require absolute loyalty, absolute discretion. The past would need to stay buried, as it were." There it was, the silk glove over the iron fist. Work for him, be owned by him, or face the consequences. Margaret set down her glass carefully. "I need time to consider." "Of course. But while you're here, let me show you something." He rose, expecting her to follow. They walked through rooms of conspicuous wealth to a study lined with books and trophies. Animal heads stared down with glass eyes, deer, elk, mountain lions. But what drew Margaret's attention was a display case containing Apache artifacts, beaded clothing, ceremonial masks, weapons, and in the center, a necklace of silver and turquoise that seemed to glow in the lamplight. "Spoils of war," Blackwood said, noticing her gaze. The Apache were formidable enemies, savage but formidable. This necklace belonged to one of their medicine women. She wore it the day she died. Margaret's hand moved involuntarily to her pocket where the carved stone rested. Mary Crow Walker. She was looking at Eli's sister's necklace, displayed like a trophy. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Blackwood moved closer, and Margaret could smell that predator scent again. "I was young then, full of fire. The Apache had been raiding our settlements, stealing cattle, killing settlers. What happened at Eagle Rock was regrettable, but necessary. They needed to learn that this land belonged to those strong enough to take it. Women and children died there." Margaret said quietly, "Yes, war is ugly, Mrs. Thorne. But from that ugliness, we built this." He gestured toward the window where his empire stretched into darkness. "Thousands of jobs, prosperity, civilization. Was the price too high, perhaps? But I sleep well knowing I did what was necessary." A knock interrupted. A servant appeared. "Dinner is served, sir." The dining room could have seated 30. They sat at opposite ends of a mahogany table that seemed to stretch forever, served by silent Mexican women who moved like ghosts. The food was elaborate roasted beef, imported vegetables, French wine, but Margaret could barely swallow. "Tell me about your late husband," Blackwood said, cutting his meat with surgical precision. "William. Wasn't it Samuel mentioned he was in shipping?" The question caught her off guard. "Yes, the China trade, primarily. Dangerous business. The China trade. Opium, silk, tea. Men could make fortunes or lose their souls." His pale eyes glinted. Sometimes both. Margaret set down her fork. If you have something to say about my husband, Mr. Blackwood, please say it plainly. He smiled. A cold expression. Very well. Your husband was present at Eagle Rock. Did you know that... The room spun. Margaret gripped the table edge. That's impossible. William was never in the Western Territories. Oh, but he was young Lieutenant William Thorne, assigned to Fort Buchanan. He was part of the detail that day. Not regular Army special assignment, keeping order among the volunteers. Blackwood sipped his wine. He filed a report afterward, very carefully worded. He saw nothing improper, heard nothing untoward, a model of military discretion. Margaret's mind reeled. William had never mentioned military service, never spoke of the West. Their entire marriage had it been built on lies. I see this is news to you, Blackwood continued. How disappointing to learn our loved ones kept secrets. But then, we all have our buried past, don't we? The question is whether we let the dead rest, or whether we dig them up and parade them through the streets. You're threatening me. I'm offering you perspective. Your husband made a choice 40 years ago. He chose silence, chose to build a life rather than destroy it with inconvenient truths. He prospered. You lived comfortably. Was that so wrong? Margaret stood abruptly. I need to leave. Sit down. The words cracked like a whip. When she remained standing, he softened his tone. Please, Mrs. Thorne, hear me out. Against her better judgment, she sat. I know you've been meeting with that savage, Crow Walker. I know he's filled your head with his version of events. But consider this: his sister was a troublemaker, stirring up the young braves, encouraging raids. What happened to her was unfortunate, but she brought it on herself. She was murdered, Margaret said flatly. She was a casualty of war, as was your brother, in his way. He leaned back, studying her. Oh, yes, I know what you're thinking. Samuel was getting close to something. Wasn't he those old documents he found? The testimony he was gathering? Did you know he planned to take it to the territorial governor, to the newspapers? Margaret's heart pounded. So you killed him? I did nothing of the sort. Fever killed your brother, as the doctor will attest. But I won't pretend I mourned his passing. He was a threat to everything I've built, everything this town depends on. Just as you could be a threat, if you choose that path. He stood, moving to the window. Look out there. Mrs. Thorne. Hundreds of families depend on my ranches, my mines, my businesses. Should they suffer because of something that happened before most of them were born? Should their children go hungry to satisfy some savage's desire for revenge? This isn't about revenge, Margaret said. It's about truth. Truth, he laughed, a sound like breaking glass. Truth is what the powerful say it is. That's the lesson the Apache learned at Eagle Rock. It's a lesson your brother failed to learn. Don't make his mistake. He returned to the table, looming over her. Work for me, Mrs. Thorne. Live comfortably, safely, or continue down this path and join your brother. Those are your choices. Margaret stood slowly, dignified despite her fear. Thank you for dinner, Mr. Blackwood. It's been illuminating. His face darkened. You're making a mistake. Perhaps, but it's mine to make. The ride back to town passed in tense silence. Margaret's mind churned with revelations. William at Eagle Rock. William choosing silence. Their entire life together built on blood money. Rosa was waiting when she returned. Worry etched on her face. Senora, what happened? Margaret told her everything. Rosa crossed herself repeatedly, muttering prayers in Spanish. You must leave, Rosa said when she finished. Tonight, take the stage to Tucson. The train from there. Forget this place. Margaret shook her head. I can't, not now, not knowing what I know. Then you will die like your brother. Maybe. Margaret touched the carved stone in her pocket. But some things are worth dying for. Samuel believed that. Maybe it's time I did too. She went to her room and sat at the small desk, taking up pen and paper. If Blackwood thought he could frighten her with threats and revelations, he'd misjudged the Cooper blood. She began to write, documenting everything: Samuel's discoveries, Eli's testimony, Blackwood's threats. If something happened to her, at least there would be a record. Outside, Redemption Gulch went about its nightly business, unaware that in a small room above a boarding house, a widow from Boston was preparing to challenge the man who owned everything. The eagle stone sat on the desk beside her, its carved wings catching the lamplight. Tomorrow she would meet with Eli again, gather more testimony. She would find the proof Samuel died seeking, and then she would make sure the truth about Eagle Rock could no longer be buried. Blackwood was right about one thing: some women went to his house and came back changed, but perhaps not in the way he'd intended. The sacred ground lay 3 hours' ride from Redemption Gulch, hidden in a canyon where red rocks rose like cathedral walls. Eli had sent word through Rosa if Margaret wanted to understand. She must come to the place where his ancestors spoke. She'd rented a horse from the livery, ignoring the stableman's warnings about a woman riding alone. The desert stretched before her, vast and unforgiving, but somehow less frightening than Blackwood's civilized mansion. Eli waited where the canyon narrowed, sitting cross-legged beside a small fire despite the day's heat. He'd prepared 2 cups of something that steamed with an earthy scent. "You came," he said simply. Margaret dismounted awkwardly, her riding skills rusty from years in Boston. "You said you had something to show me." "First, we drink." He offered her a cup. "This opens the eyes to see what was hidden." Margaret hesitated. Everything she'd been taught warned against drinking strange concoctions with Apache men in isolated places. But she thought of William's hidden past, of Samuel's death, of truths buried beneath lies. She drank. The tea was bitter, herbal, with an aftertaste of smoke and earth. At first, nothing happened. Then the canyon walls seemed to shimmer, and the air grew thick with memory. "This place," Eli said, his voice coming from far away, "is where my people came to speak with the spirits, where Mary brought her children to learn the old ways." "Mary, your sister. Tell me about her." His weathered face softened with memory. "She was a medicine woman, like our grandmother, could heal with plants, speak to the eagles. She married young Robert Crowwalker, a good man. They had a daughter, Anna, only 3 winters when—" His voice caught. "When Eagle Rock happened." Margaret felt the ground tilt. Whether from the tea or the story, she couldn't say. The missing child in the reports. "Not missing, hidden." Eli stared into the fire. "When the soldiers came, Mary knew. Spirits warned her. She gave Anna to me, told me to run, but she stayed, said the people needed her strength." The fire seemed to burn higher, and in the flames, Margaret saw shapes riders approaching a peaceful camp, women grinding corn, children playing, then chaos, screams, gunfire. "Your husband was there." Eli continued. "Young soldier, tried to stop it. I saw him pull Blackwood away from a woman. Heard him shouting about orders, about law, but there was no law that day, only blood." Margaret's throat constricted. So William had tried, late perhaps, insufficient certainly, but he'd tried. It didn't absolve him of his later silence, but it was something. "After," Eli said, "they searched for Anna, Blackwood especially. He wanted no witnesses, no survivors who might remember. Your husband helped us, told them he saw the child's body in the river, lied to his commanding officer, risked court-martial. But why keep silent later? Why not tell the truth? Fear, shame. Blackwood had power even then. Those who spoke against him had accidents. Your husband was young, frightened. He took his discharge and fled east." Eli's dark eyes found hers. Perhaps he thought distance would quiet the ghosts. But ghosts follow. Margaret understood now why William had never spoken of the West, why he'd sometimes cried out in his sleep, why he'd drunk himself to death slowly over the years. The weight of Eagle Rock had crushed him as surely as if the stones had fallen on his body. What happened to Anna? I raised her as my daughter. She married, had children, lives on the reservation now, safe but not free. He pulled something from his pouch, a photograph, cracked with age. A middle-aged Apache woman with Eli's eyes and a gentle smile. She doesn't know the whole truth. Better that way. Margaret studied the photo. This woman should have inherited her mother's gifts, should have walked freely on her ancestral land. Instead, she lived caged on a reservation while her mother's killer displayed stolen treasures in his mansion. The fire was dying, the visions fading, but one more scene played out Samuel. Sitting in this very spot months ago, drinking the same tea, seeing the same truths. His face was anguished but determined. Your brother was good man, Eli said. He wept for the dead, said he would make it right. I told him the past cannot be changed, only honored, but he wouldn't listen. Blackwood says Samuel's death was fever. Eli's laugh was bitter. White man's fever, the kind that strikes those who ask too many questions. He stood, joints creaking. Come, there's more. He led her deeper into the canyon, to a place where ancient pictures marked the rock's spirals. Human figures, eagles in flight. At the base of the cliff, protected by an overhang, lay a carefully tended grave. No marker, but the stones were arranged in the shape of a soaring bird. Mary, Margaret whispered. I brought her here after, couldn't leave her for the soldiers to dishonor. He knelt, placing tobacco on the stones. 40 years I've tended this grave. 40 years of silence while her killer grew fat on stolen land. Margaret knelt beside him, tears streaming down her face. For Mary, for Samuel, for all the buried dead. Eli, why did you say those words when we met about God saying I belong here? He was quiet for a long moment. The night your brother died, I had a vision. Eagles spoke to me, said a woman would come from the eastern waters. Said she would carry the truth like fire, burn away the lies. When I saw you at the train station, lost, alone, but not broken, I knew. I'm nobody special, just a widow from Boston. Moses was just a shepherd. David was just a boy with stones. He stood, helping her up. The spirits choose who they will. They rode back as the sun set, painting the desert in shades of fire. At the edge of town, Eli stopped. Blackwood will move against you soon. He's afraid. I know. There's something else. He reached into his saddlebag, pulled out a leather portfolio. Your brother gave me this before he died. Said if anything happened, give it to you. Margaret opened it with trembling hands. Inside were documents, military reports, witness statements, even a sworn affidavit from a soldier named Patrick O'Brien detailing the massacre. But the most damning was a contract, signed by Blackwood and others, dated 1 week before Eagle Rock, a contract for Apache land, contingent on the removal of its inhabitants. This proves premeditation. Margaret breathed. This proves murder. Proof means nothing without power to enforce it. Blackwood owns the judge, the sheriff, the newspaper. Then I'll go beyond his reach. The territorial governor, the federal authorities. Someone must listen. Eli studied her with those ancient eyes. You could still run, take the evidence and go. Why risk your life for dead Apache and a brother you cannot save? Margaret thought of her life in Boston, safe, comfortable, suffocating. She thought of William, drowning his guilt in whiskey, of Samuel, dying for truth, of Mary Crow Walker, staying to face death because her people needed her strength. Because someone should have stood up 40 years ago, she said. Because my husband stayed silent and it destroyed him. Because my brother died trying to make it right. And because... She touched the carved eagle stone in her pocket. Because maybe God, or the spirits, or simple human decency says I belong here, doing this. Eli nodded slowly. Then you understand. Sometimes we choose our path. Sometimes the path chooses us. Either way, we must walk it. He turned his horse and disappeared into the gathering darkness. Margaret sat for a moment, looking at the lights of Redemption Gulch spread below. Somewhere in that town, Blackwood was planning her destruction. But she had weapons now, truth, evidence, and the courage born of understanding. She thought of the vision in the fire, of cavalry charging an innocent camp, of William, young and horrified, trying too late to stop it, of Mary Crow Walker, sending her daughter to safety before facing death with dignity. The past couldn't be changed, but it could be honored. It could be revealed. It could, perhaps, finally be laid to rest. Margaret urged her horse forward. Down into the lights of town. She had preparations to make, letters to write, evidence to secure. Tomorrow she would begin the fight of her life. But tonight she would rest in the knowledge that she'd chosen her stand. In her pocket, the eagle stone seemed to pulse with warmth, as if the spirit of Mary Crow Walker approved. Margaret rode through the darkness, no longer the proper Boston widow, but something harder, truer, a woman who'd drunk sacred tea and seen visions, who'd knelt at a hidden grave and sworn silent oaths. A woman who belonged here, in this hard place, at this moment, carrying truth like fire to burn away 40 years of lies. The search consumed Margaret for 3 days. She turned Samuel's room into a map of evidence. Papers spread across every surface, connected by threads of logic and chronology. The leather portfolio from Eli had contained treasures Patrick O'Brien's affidavit was damning. But she needed more, always more. On the morning of the 4th day, she found it, hidden in the spine of Samuel's Bible. Folded so thin she'd almost missed it, a letter in William's hand, dated just months before his death. Her hands shook as she read her late husband's confession. My darling Margaret, if you are reading this, then I am gone, and somehow you have found your way to the place of my greatest shame. I write this in the hope that truth might finally free us both from the prison I built with my silence. The letter detailed everything. Young Lieutenant Thorne, ambitious and naive, assigned to keep order during what was supposed to be a peaceful relocation. Blackwood's promises of land and wealth to those who supported him. The night before Eagle Rock, when William discovered the true plan, I tried to warn them, William wrote, but Blackwood had men watching. When I reached the camp, it was too late. The killing had begun. I saw him shoot Mary Crow Walker himself, laughing as she fell. I struck him, tried to stop it, but his men held me back. Afterward, he came to me with an offer of silence for safety. He had witnesses who would swear I participated in the massacre. My word against his empire. I was a coward. Margaret, I chose silence. I chose you. Margaret pressed the letter to her chest, tears flowing freely. All those years of watching William fade, of not understanding his nightmares, his drinking, his desperate need to atone through charity and good works. He'd been dying of Eagle Rock long before the whiskey claimed him. But there was more. William had spent his final years gathering evidence, corresponding with other soldiers, tracking down witnesses. The bottom of the trunk held his work letters from veterans, maps showing the true boundaries of Apache territory, even a signed statement from Blackwood's former partner, Jacob Thornberry, who'd fled to California after Eagle Rock, sickened by what they'd done. Thornberry, Margaret whispered. According to the documents, he was still alive, running a shop in Sacramento, a living witness to Blackwood's crimes. She worked through the night, organizing everything into a comprehensive case. Dawn found her exhausted but determined. The evidence packed into 2 sets, one to take with her, one hidden with Rosa for safekeeping. A sharp knock interrupted her work. Sheriff Daniels stood in the hallway, hat in hand, badge glinting in the morning light. He was Blackwood's man through and through, but his eyes held something unexpected shame. Mrs. Thorne, I'm here on official business. There's been a complaint about stolen property. I need to search your room. By whose complaint? Though she knew the answer. Mr. Blackwood believes you have documents belonging to him. Items taken from his property during your dinner visit. Margaret stood tall despite her exhaustion. Everything here belonged to my brother or my late husband. You're welcome to examine it all. She gestured to the papers covering every surface. Though I suspect Mr. Blackwood's definition of his property might include anything that threatens his version of history. Daniels shifted uncomfortably. He was near 60, old enough to remember Eagle Rock. Ma'am, I'm just doing my job. Your job. Margaret picked up O'Brien's affidavit. Tell me, Sheriff, what's your job when the law protects murderers and silences truth? He flinched. I need to look around. Ma'am, please don't make this difficult. Margaret stepped aside. She'd anticipated this, hidden the most crucial documents with Rosa. Let him find what remained. It would tell Blackwood she had evidence, but not how much. Daniels searched perfunctorily, clearly uncomfortable with the task. He paused at William's letter, read a few lines, and his face went pale. Jesus Christ, he muttered, then caught himself. Pardon, ma'am. You knew my husband. Met him once, years back. He came through town, asking questions. Good man, troubled, but good. He set the letter down carefully. Ma'am, I can't find any stolen property here, but if I might offer some advice. You might. Whatever you're planning, whatever justice you're seeking, Blackwood has resources you can't imagine. He's survived 40 years of challenges to his empire. Men stronger than you have tried and failed. Men, Margaret said quietly. Yes, I imagine they have. After Daniels left, Rosa appeared with coffee and a warning. The town is talking. Blackwood has put word out anyone who helps you loses their job, their home, maybe worse. I'm sorry, Senora. But after today, you cannot stay here. Margaret understood. Rosa had risked enough. You've been kind beyond measure. I won't endanger you further. Where will you go? Margaret thought of Thornberry in California, of government offices in Phoenix, of newspapers in San Francisco. Wherever the truth needs to be heard. She spent the day making preparations. The bank, unsurprisingly, refused to cash her letter of credit. The telegraph office claimed the lines were down. Even the general store wouldn't sell her supplies. Blackwood was tightening the noose. As sunset approached, a young Mexican boy appeared at her door. Senor Eli sends word. Meet at the old mission tonight. Bring what matters. The mission sat 3 miles outside town, abandoned for decades. Margaret packed her evidence, strapped on Samuel's gun, and slipped out through Rosa's kitchen. The streets were empty. Too empty. Blackwood's men were somewhere, watching. She took a circuitous route, doubling back twice, using skills learned from childhood games with Samuel. Hide and seek with deadly stakes. The mission loomed against the stars, its bell tower broken, walls crumbling, but candlelight flickered within. Eli waited in what had been the sanctuary, but he wasn't alone. A dozen Apache men and women sat in a circle, faces painted for ceremony. Among them, Margaret recognized the woman from the photograph, Anna, Mary Crow Walker's daughter. You came, Eli said. Good. It's time you heard the rest. Anna stood, moving with her mother's grace, despite her years. My uncle says you seek justice for my mother, that you have proof of the murder. I have documents, testimony, papers. Anna's voice was bitter. 40 years we wait for papers while my mother's spirit walks unquiet, while her killer grows fat on our sacred land. Hey, Anna, Eli warned. No, Uncle, she should know. Anna turned to Margaret. Your brother promised justice. We gave him our stories, our pain. Now he's dead, and you come with more promises. Why should we believe? Margaret understood the anger, the suspicion. How many promises had been broken? How many times had they trusted white justice? Because I have nothing left to lose. Margaret said simply, "My husband is dead, my brother is dead, my old life is dead. All I have is this truth and the need to speak it." She pulled out the eagle stone. "And this?" Anna's breath caught. "My mother's work. She carved it for me before I was born." She took the stone with trembling hands. "Uncle, how?" "Samuel found it at Eagle Rock, kept it safe." Margaret looked around the circle. "I can't bring back the dead. I can't restore what was stolen. But I can make sure the world knows what happened. That has to count for something." An elder spoke in Apache. Eli translated. "He asks what you need from us." Testimony. Witnesses who remember. Not just for courts that may not listen, but for history, for the record. So no one can deny or forget. The circle debated in their language, voices rising and falling like desert wind. Finally, Anna spoke. "We will help, not for you, but for the unquiet dead, and for this." She held up documents Margaret had never seen. Marriage certificate, land transfer, legal papers my mother saved. They prove this land was legally ours when Blackwood stole it. Margaret's heart raced. With these papers and everything else, they had an ironclad case. "This is extraordinary. How did you—" "My mother hid them before the attack. I've kept them 40 years, waiting for someone with the power to use them." Anna studied Margaret with eyes that had seen too much. "Are you that someone?" "I will be." They worked through the night, recording testimony, copying documents, preparing multiple sets of evidence. By dawn, Margaret had enough to bury Blackwood in any honest court. The question was finding one. As the sun rose, Eli pulled her aside. "Blackwood knows you're here. His men surround the mission. You can't go back to town." Margaret had expected this. "Then I go forward. To Sacramento first, to find Thornbury, then to the territorial capital. Will you come?" "My place is here, protecting my people. But Anna will go. She speaks both languages, knows both laws. Together, you might succeed." Margaret looked at Mary Crow Walker's daughter, seeing strength born of survival. Two women, bound by different losses, seeking the same justice. "When do we leave?" "Now," Anna said. "My son waits with horses beyond the ridge. We ride for the railway at Tucson." She smiled grimly. "Let Blackwood chase shadows in his empty town while we carry truth to the world." Margaret gathered her evidence, checked Samuel's gun, and prepared to ride into an uncertain future. But for the first time since arriving in Redemption Gulch, she felt hope, not for herself, but for the truth that demanded its day. The mission bells had long since fallen, but in the morning light, Margaret heard them anyway, ringing for the dead, for justice, for two women riding toward a reckoning 40 years in the making. The saloon fell silent when Margaret pushed through the swinging doors. Every eye turned to the woman in the gray traveling dress, dusty from hard riding, standing where decent women didn't belong. She'd returned to Redemption Gulch after 2 weeks away, and the town held its breath. Rosa had sent word that Blackwood was spreading lies claiming Margaret had stolen money, that she was delusional with grief, that she'd been consorting with savages. He'd grown confident in her absence, certain she'd fled for good. He was about to learn otherwise. Margaret made her way to the bar, ignoring the whispers. The bartender, a florid Irishman named Murphy, polished a glass nervously. "Mrs. Thorne, this ain't no place for whiskey," she said clearly. "And send word to Josiah Blackwood that I'll be making an announcement here at sunset. Tell him it concerns Eagle Rock and the truth he's tried to bury for 40 years. The saloon erupted in murmurs. Murphy poured her drink with shaking hands. "Ma'am, you sure you know what you're doing?" Margaret raised the glass to her lips, the whiskey burning like liquid courage. "For the first time in my life, Mr. Murphy, I'm absolutely certain." Word spread like wildfire. By sunset, the saloon was packed. Merchants, miners, cowboys, even some of the proper ladies who normally wouldn't set foot in such a place. They all came to see the show, The Boston Widow against the Titan of Redemption Gulch. Blackwood arrived with his usual theatrical flair, flanked by 6 armed men. He wore his best black suit, silver watch chain glinting, every inch the successful businessman. His pale eyes found Margaret immediately, standing calmly by the bar. "Mrs. Thorne," he said, voice carrying easily through the hushed room. "I heard you wanted to discuss ancient history, though I must say, spreading slander about respected citizens is dangerous business." "Slander implies falsehood," Margaret replied. "I deal only in truth." She moved to the center of the room, reached into her bag, and pulled out a photograph. "This is Anna Crow Walker, daughter of Mary Crow Walker. Some of you remember Mary, a healer, a mother, murdered at Eagle Rock 40 years ago." "Enough," Blackwood stepped forward. "I won't have you filling these good people's heads with lies about long-settled matters." "Settled?" Margaret's voice rose. "Yes, let's talk about how it was settled. With blood, with theft, with 40 years of silence enforced by fear." She pulled out document after document. "Here's the contract you signed. Mr. Blackwood, 1 week before Eagle Rock, payment for Apache land, contingent on removal of inhabitants. Here's the testimony of Private Patrick O'Brien, describing how you personally shot Mary Crow Walker. Here's the statement of your former partner, Jacob Thornberry, still alive in Sacramento, detailing the massacre you planned." The crowd stirred restlessly. Some of the older residents exchanged knowing looks they remembered, even if they'd never dared speak of it. Blackwood's face had gone pale, then red. "Forgeries. This woman is deranged with grief." Her brother filled her head with fantasies. "My brother died seeking justice, just as you intended." Margaret faced the crowd. "How many of you have lost someone who asked too many questions? How many have been threatened for speaking about Eagle Rock?" A murmur ran through the room. Old Tom Bailey, the blacksmith, stepped forward. "I remember. I was young, but I remember the wagons coming back, the blood, the silence after." "Shut your mouth, Bailey," one of Blackwood's men growled, hand moving to his gun. Sheriff Daniels stepped between them. "There'll be no violence here." He looked troubled, conflicted. The evidence Margaret had shown him days ago had clearly been working on his conscience. Margaret pressed on. "But the truly damning evidence comes from an unexpected source." She pulled out William's letter. "My own husband's confession? Lieutenant William Thorne, who was there, who tried to stop it, who was threatened into silence. He spent his last years gathering evidence, dying of guilt and whiskey because he couldn't live with what he'd seen." She read portions aloud, William's words painting the horror in stark detail. Women in the crowd wept. Men who'd fought in wars looked sick. Even some of Blackwood's supporters seemed shaken. "This proves nothing," Blackwood roared. "The ravings of a drunk, the fantasies of a bitter widow." "Then let's ask someone who was there." Margaret turned to the door. "Anna?" Anna Crow Walker entered with quiet dignity, wearing traditional Apache dress. Behind her came 3 other Apache witnesses, all survivors or children of survivors. The crowd parted, some with respect, others with the ingrained fear Blackwood had cultivated. "My mother was Mary Crow Walker," Anna said, her voice clear and strong. "She was 26 when Josiah Blackwood murdered her. I was 3, hidden in the rocks, listening to my mother's screams for 40 years. I've waited for justice. Today, I speak her name in the place of her killer's power, and I am not afraid." She held up the legal documents. "These papers prove the land Mr. Blackwood built his empire on was legally transferred to my family. The massacre at Eagle Rock wasn't just murder, it was theft. Every building in this town, every mine, every ranch sits on stolen land soaked in innocent blood." Blackwood's control finally snapped. Savages and liars, you take their word over mine. I built this town. I brought civilization to this wasteland. Without me, you'd all be nothing. Without you, Margaret said quietly, 43 Apache would still be alive. My brother would still be alive. My husband might have lived without the bottle and the nightmares. She faced the crowd one final time. I've sent copies of all this evidence to the territorial governor, to newspapers in San Francisco and Denver, to federal authorities in Washington. The truth is beyond Blackwood's reach now. The question is, what will you do with it? Silence stretched taut. Then Rosa Gonzalez stepped forward. I believe her. Samuel Cooper was a good man who died for the truth. So was my nephew, said another voice. Asked questions about old mining claims, had an accident. More voices joined in, years of fear breaking like a dam. Stories of threats, mysterious deaths, the weight of Blackwood's power that had crushed dissent for 4 decades. Blackwood looked around wildly, seeing his empire crumble in the faces of those who'd feared him. You fools, you need me without my money. This town dies, my ranches employ half of you, my mines the other half. Stand against me and you'll starve. Maybe, said Sheriff Daniels, stepping forward. But we'll starve honest. Josiah Blackwood, I'm arresting you for the murder of Samuel Cooper. You can't prove... Maybe not in court, Daniels admitted. But there's enough here to hold you while federal marshals investigate. And something tells me once they start digging, they'll find more bodies than just Samuel's. Blackwood's men looked uncertain, hands hovering near weapons. The crowd pressed closer, anger replacing decades of fear. These weren't hired guns from outside. These were local men who'd taken Blackwood's coin, but lived among the people now facing them down. One by one, they stepped back. You'll regret this, Blackwood snarled as Daniels approached with shackles. All of you, I'll see this town burn before I'm through. No, Margaret said firmly. You'll see justice. 40 years late, but justice nonetheless. As Daniels led Blackwood away, the crowd erupted. Some cheered. Some wept. Some stood stunned by the sudden shift in their world. Anna Crow Walker began singing in Apache a mourning song for the dead, a celebration for truth finally spoken. Margaret found herself surrounded by people wanting to shake her hand, to share their own stories, to thank her for courage they wished they'd found themselves. But she felt no triumph, only exhaustion and a strange emptiness. The work was done. Samuel was avenged. The truth was free. Later, as the crowd dispersed, Eli appeared at her elbow. She hadn't seen him enter, but somehow wasn't surprised. You did what you promised, he said simply. It's not over. Trials, testimony, the long work of justice. No, but the silence is broken. The dead can rest. He studied her with those knowing eyes. What will you do now? Margaret looked around the saloon, at the town already beginning to reshape itself without Blackwood's shadow. I don't know. For the first time in my life, I truly don't know. Good, Eli said. That's when life begins, when we stop knowing and start discovering. He disappeared into the crowd, leaving Margaret alone with her thoughts and the weight of choices yet to make. The truth had set Redemption Gulch free. Now perhaps it could do the same for her. The federal marshals arrived within a week, transforming Redemption Gulch into a hive of investigation. Blackwood sat in his own jail, the irony not lost on anyone. While prosecutors from Phoenix built their case, Margaret testified for hours, presenting evidence, answering questions, reliving every moment since she'd stepped off that train platform. But it was the town itself that truly changed. Without Blackwood's iron grip, people began to breathe freely. The Apache were invited to town meetings for the first time. Mexican workers demanded fair wages and got them. Even the saloon girls walked taller, no longer subject to Blackwood's private arrangements. Margaret stood at the edge of town one evening, watching the sunset paint the desert in shades of copper and gold. The sacred lands that had been sealed off for 40 years were open again. She could see Apache families visiting graves, performing ceremonies that had been forbidden. It's a sight, isn't it? Eli appeared beside her, as was his way, the land remembering itself. I've been thinking about William, Margaret said. He was weak, yes, but he tried. In his way, at the end, he tried to make amends. The dead don't need our forgiveness, only our understanding. They stood in comfortable silence, two unlikely allies who'd changed the course of history. Then Eli spoke again. There's something you should see. He led her back to the sacred canyon, to the place of visions. But this time, no ceremonies awaited. Instead, Anna Crow Walker stood with several other Apache, examining documents spread on flat stones. Margaret. Anna smiled, the first genuine smile Margaret had seen from her. We're planning. Planning? The return, with Blackwood's claims void and the original deeds honored. This land returns to us. Not all of it too much has changed, but the sacred sites, the water rights, the places that matter. She gestured to the maps. We're going to build something new. Not a reservation, but a community, Apache and others, working together. That's wonderful, Margaret said, meaning it. We want you to be part of it. Anna continued, you've proven yourself a friend. We'll need someone who understands both laws, both worlds. Margaret's throat tightened. I'm honored, but think about it. Eli interrupted gently. No rush. The desert teaches patience. They returned to town as stars emerged in the vast sky. Margaret's room at Rosa's boarding house felt smaller than ever, cramped with possibilities she'd never imagined. Boston seemed like another lifetime. The widow who'd arrived here desperate and lost was gone, replaced by what? A knock interrupted her musings. Sheriff Daniels stood in the hallway, hat in hand. Mrs. Thorne, might I have a word? She invited him in, noting his discomfort. He was a good man who'd made compromises, now trying to find his way back to integrity. I wanted to apologize, he began, for the years of looking away, for not protecting your brother. You were one man against an empire. That's no excuse. He shifted awkwardly. I also wanted to say the town council met tonight. We're restructuring everything. New judges, new systems. Trying to build something clean. We could use good people. People with courage. Margaret almost laughed. Sheriff, I'm a 58-year-old widow from Boston. I know nothing about frontier governance. You know about justice. That's more than most. He placed a document on her table. It's an offer. Town administrator. Help us rebuild right this time. After he left, Margaret sat staring at the paper. 2 offers in one day, 2 possible futures in this unlikely place. She walked to the window, looking out at Redemption Gulch. The saloon still rang with music, but it sounded different now, freer, lighter. She saw Apache and Mexican and white mingling in the streets, wary still but trying. She saw Rosa organizing a group of women, probably planning the school they'd always wanted, but Blackwood had denied. This place had taken everything from her, her brother, her illusions about her marriage, her safe Boston life, but it had given her something too. Purpose, truth, the knowledge that one person could stand up and change things. A movement in the shadows caught her eye, a figure on horseback, watching her window, even in darkness. She recognized Eli's silhouette. He touched his hat brim in salute, then rode toward the desert. She knew he'd return when needed. He always did. Margaret lit her lamp and began writing letters to friends in Boston, explaining why she wouldn't return, to Anna, accepting a role in the new community, to Sheriff Daniels, agreeing to help rebuild the town, to Samuel's grave, though she'd never send it, telling him his work was complete. As she wrote, she thought about Eli's strange words that first night. God said you belong here. Be my bride. She understood now. Not a literal proposal, but a calling. The desert had claimed her, married her to its harsh truths and hidden beauties. She belonged to this land of redemption and revelation. The next morning brought news. Blackwood, faced with federal charges and a town turned against him, had confessed, not to everything, but to enough. He'd go to prison, his empire dissolved, his name forever linked to massacre and theft. It wasn't perfect justice. Nothing could restore the 40 years of lives lost and destroyed, but it was something. Margaret joined the crowd gathered to watch the marshals take him away. Blackwood looked older, smaller, just a bitter man in shackles. As the prison wagon passed, his pale eyes found Margaret. "You've destroyed everything," he spat. "No," she replied calmly. "I've set it free." The wagon rolled on, taking Redemption Gulch's tyrant to his fate. The crowd dispersed slowly, people talking about the future instead of fearing the past. Margaret saw Anna teaching Apache words to white children. She saw Rosa and the Mexican women planning their school openly. She saw Sheriff Daniels removing Blackwood's men from positions of power. Change, real change, painful and necessary and overdue. That afternoon, Margaret visited Samuel's grave. She placed desert wildflowers on the stone and sat in the dust beside him. "It's done," she said simply. "Not the way you planned, maybe, but done. The truth is free, and so am I." The wind whispered through the cemetery, and for a moment, she could almost hear Samuel's laugh. He'd always said she was stronger than she knew, braver than Boston allowed. He'd been right, as usual. She stood, brushing dust from her skirts. There was work to do, a town to rebuild, communities to bridge, justice to maintain. It wouldn't be easy. Nothing in the desert was easy. But it was real, honest work, under an endless sky that demanded truth. As she walked back to town, Margaret passed the train station where her journey had begun. A new train was pulling in, bringing supplies and strangers and possibilities. She remembered standing on that platform, lost and terrified, certain her life was over. How wrong she'd been. It had just begun. The sun set behind the mountains, painting Redemption Gulch in shades of hope, somewhere in the desert. Eli Crow Walker rode his eternal patrol between worlds, in the Apache camps. Anna prepared for the return to sacred lands. In the town, people dared to dream of a future not built on blood. And Margaret Thorne, unlikely catalyst of change, walked toward tomorrow with steady steps. She'd found her place at last, not in the comfortable prisons of the East, but here in this hard, honest land that had tested her and found her worthy. The desert had made its proposal, and she had accepted. She belonged here, where truth mattered more than comfort, where courage counted more than convention, where a widow from Boston could help write a new chapter in an old story of loss and redemption. The stars emerged one by one, ancient witnesses to all that had passed and all that was to come, and Redemption Gulch, finally living up to its name, prepared for a future as vast and promising as the western sky. 6 months had passed since Blackwood's empire fell. The desert bloomed after unexpected rains, covering the harsh landscape in brilliant wildflowers, yellow brittlebush, purple lupine, crimson tuberosa. Nature itself seemed to celebrate Redemption Gulch's transformation. Margaret stood in the new town office, reviewing plans for the irrigation project that would bring Apache farming methods to the valley. Through her window, she could see the schoolhouse Rosa had built, where Apache, Mexican, and white children learned together. The sound of their laughter carried on the morning breeze. A familiar figure appeared in her doorway. Eli Crow Walker removed his hat, silver hair catching the light. Age had lined his face like a map of hard-traveled roads, but his dark eyes held the same deep knowing that had first unsettled her at the train station. "The council meets today," he said simply. Margaret nodded. The Redemption Valley Council, Apache elders, town representatives, ranchers, miners would vote on the final land distribution. Months of negotiation had led to this moment. "Are you ready?" she asked. "The question is whether they are ready." He moved to the window, watching the children play. 40 years of hate doesn't wash away in one season. "No, but look at them. Eli, the children don't carry our scars." "Not yet." They walked together to the meeting hall, formerly Blackwood's Bank, now transformed into a place of community gathering. The irony pleased Margaret. Where greed once ruled, cooperation now struggled to bloom. The hall filled quickly. Anna Crow Walker sat with the Apache delegation, wearing her mother's turquoise necklace recovered from Blackwood's mansion and returned with ceremony. Sheriff Daniels led the town representatives. Even some of Blackwood's former cowboys had stayed, willing to work honest jobs for honest wages. The debate was passionate but respectful. Maps were spread, boundaries discussed, water rights negotiated. Margaret mediated, drawing on skills learned in Boston drawing rooms but tempered by desert wisdom. By sunset, they had an agreement. Not perfect, but fair. The sacred sites returned to Apache control. Townland secured for all residents. Shared grazing rights. Water distributed equitably. As people filed out, celebrating or grumbling according to their nature, Eli remained behind. Margaret joined him in the empty hall, both looking at the maps that represented so much pain and possibility. "My sister would be proud," he said quietly. Samuel, too. They stood in comfortable silence. Two souls who'd found unexpected kinship in loss and purpose. Then Eli spoke again, his voice different, uncertain in a way she'd never heard. "Margaret, do you remember what I said when we first met?" Her breath caught. "God said you belong here. Be my bride." I spoke truth, but not all truth. He turned to face her, and she saw vulnerability in those ancient eyes. "The vision showed me a woman from the East who would bring justice, but it showed me more. It showed me companionship in my last years. It showed me love." Margaret's hand moved to her throat. At 58, she'd thought such feelings were behind her, but standing in this hall where they'd fought for justice together, looking at this man who'd walked between worlds and chosen to let her in, she felt something stir that she'd thought dead with William. "Eli, I'm not a young man. I have little to offer. No fine house, no Boston manners. Just truth and respect and the desert's hard beauty." He smiled, years falling away. "But I would share what years remain, if you're willing." Margaret thought of her life, the proper Boston marriage built on lies, the years of suffocating propriety, the journey that had stripped everything false away. She thought of Eli's steady presence, his quiet strength, the way he appeared when needed and understood silence. "I'm not young either," she said softly. "And I'm not the woman who stepped off that train. The desert has changed me." "No, it revealed you. The strength was always there." She reached for his weathered hand. "Then yes. Yes to whatever years we have. Yes to truth over comfort. Yes to this unlikely love that God or spirits or simple human need has given us." His smile transformed his face. "Then we should do this properly. Apache way and white way both. Anna will perform the Apache ceremony. Sheriff Daniels can handle the legal parts."
"When?"
"Tomorrow. Next month, time moves differently in the desert." He squeezed her hand. "When it feels right, we'll know." They left the hall together, walking through streets that had seen so much change. People nodded respectfully, the Apache elder and the Boston widow who'd become Redemption Gulch's conscience and hope. At Rosa's boarding house, they paused. "I should tell you," Eli said with rare humor. "Apache husbands sometimes live with their wife's family." Margaret laughed, surprising them both. "Then you'll have to tolerate my cooking. Boston cuisine meets desert herbs." "I survived war and exile. I can survive your cooking." They parted with promises to meet tomorrow, to plan this unexpected future. Margaret climbed to her room soon to be just a memory and lit her lamp. She had letters to write, arrangements to make. But first, she stood at her window, looking out at the town she'd helped transform. The stars emerged in their eternal patterns. Somewhere, an owl called. In the Apache camps, ceremonial fires burned as they had for centuries, no longer hidden. The desert breathed its ancient rhythms, and Margaret breathed with it. She thought of that terrified woman on the train platform, certain her life was ending. How limited her vision had been. Life had been preparing its greatest chapters, love found in unlikely places, purpose discovered through loss, strength revealed by testing. A month later, they married at Eagle Rock as dawn broke over the canyon. Anna performed the Apache blessing while Sheriff Daniels read the legal words. Rosa stood as witness with half the town. Apache and Mexican and white mingled freely. The ceremony was simple desert wildflowers, traditional songs, vows spoken in 3 languages. "You came seeking your brother," Eli said as they stood where his sister had died and been reborn in justice. "You found yourself." "I found more than that," Margaret replied, touching his face. "I found home." They made their life in a simple adobe house between town and Apache lands, bridge between worlds. Margaret continued her work building the new Redemption Gulch while Eli taught young Apache the old ways and new accommodations. Evenings found them on their porch, watching sunsets paint the desert in impossible colors. One such evening, as storm clouds gathered over distant mountains, Eli spoke into their comfortable silence. "The spirits were right. You belonged here, not just for justice, but for this showing that people can change, can choose love over hate." Margaret leaned against his shoulder. "Do you think the dead rest easier now?" "Yes, Mary, Samuel, even your William. They see that their suffering led to healing." Thunder rumbled in the distance. "And they see that 2 old fools found joy in their autumn years." The rain came then, blessing the desert with life-giving water. They sat protected by their porch roof, hands entwined, watching the land drink deeply. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, it always did. But tonight, they were simply Margaret and Eli, unlikely lovers who'd found each other in the crucible of truth and emerged transformed. Lightning illuminated the desert in brief, brilliant moments. In those flashes, Margaret saw it all, the harsh beauty that had tested her, the sacred places that had revealed her, the community that had claimed her. She'd come west seeking her brother and found her true self. She'd pursued justice and discovered love. She'd lost everything and gained the world. "No regrets?" Eli asked, feeling her deep sigh. "None," Margaret said firmly. "For the first time in my life, no regrets at all." The storm passed, leaving the air clean and sharp with a scent of creosote and sage. Stars emerged between racing clouds, and in a simple adobe house where love had built its unlikely bridge, 2 hearts beat in rhythm with the eternal desert, proof that redemption could bloom in the most unexpected soil. As they finally went inside, Margaret turned for one last look at Redemption Gulch, sparkling with rain and promise in the distance. She'd helped write a new chapter in its story, but more than that, she'd written a new chapter in her own, one of courage, truth, and love that transcended every boundary. The desert had proposed, and she had accepted fully. She was home. Thank you for listening to this tale from the Wild West. If you're enjoying these stories of love, loss, and redemption in the American frontier, we'd love to know where in the world you're listening from. Please subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts in the comments below. Your stories and feedback help keep the spirit of the Old West alive for modern audiences. Until next time, partners.